Like with most anime fans, I don't have a particularly good relationship with live-action adaptations of these stories that I love. Whether it's the infamous abomination that is Dragon Ball Evolution, hardly resembling its namesake at all, or the live-action Death Note completely missing what made the characters and the story special, but Willem Dafoe as Ryuk is still absolutely god-level casting, or the live-action Cowboy Bebop trying very hard to replicate the original's unique aesthetics while severely disappointing in other areas. To me, there's just usually some inherent charm of anime and manga that gets lost in translation to a live-action medium. Bringing concrete reality to it usually doesn't feel right to me. It typically takes something away, and I've never seen a live-action anime adaptation actually be superior to its source material, at least not yet. Recently, One Piece had its first live-action adaptation, and it's mostly been proclaimed as the best one we've ever gotten. And I'd probably agree, but to me it still had plenty of flaws that held it back from being truly fantastic, but it did overall capture the heart of the story, and I do love that it's getting some people to give the anime or the manga a chance. That's a huge win. I was terrified when they first announced it, but in the end it was an imperfect, inoffensive, and at times extremely fun project that didn't scare me away from the eventual season 2. And I also recently watched Netflix's new Yu Yu Hakusho adaptation, and I had a mostly positive experience, even though it was very condensed. But it was also one that I surprisingly didn't hate, even with its fair share of problems, but I'll probably expand on that another time. So things have seemed to be improving overall in recent years as far as anime adaptations, at least with the ones I've seen, but when it comes down to it, some of these adaptations are just horrible, and the best ones are usually just kind of okay or passable or like decent. I hadn't watched one that really truly impressed me or made me overjoyed that a live action interpretation even exists. Actually, except for you, Alita Battle Angel. You were rad. Give me the sequel. Anyway, as most of you know, I've been reading through Bleach for the first time, and after realizing that this movie exists, I thought I should check it out, but I told myself I would do that as some sort of special thing. And seeing that this channel has somehow, miraculously, crossed 5,000 subscribers, which is absolutely insane to me, and I can't begin to express how humbled I am by that and how much I appreciate everyone, this seemed like a fun way to celebrate this milestone with all of you. To thank you for coming along this journey with me and being an amazing group of people. So grab your popcorn buckets and let's talk about the live-action movie adaptation of Tite Kubo's Bleach. There will be spoilers discussed, so if you haven't seen the movie, go watch it and come back, or proceed if you don't care about hearing about the whole movie. I've got to say, right off the bat, it was much better than I expected it to be. Unlike some of the adaptations I previously named, there was clearly some real passion here, or at least it was made by people who seemed to actually respect the source material. There was nothing that seemed insanely out of place or that ever made me think that the people making this have never actually looked at the manga or anime. And yes, that's definitely happened before. The setting and the characters all felt pretty accurate for the most part. Nobody was unrecognizable like what happens sometimes with these kinds of movies. The storyline was in most ways very similar, but with some obvious changes to adapt it to a feature-length film. Essentially, the movie is an extremely abbreviated version of the initial substitute arc of the manga and anime. The broad strokes go from the beginning of the story up until Rukia gets taken back to Soul Society, and it's the journey from point A to point B that is altered for, a movie-length runtime instead of dozens of chapters or like 20 episodes. Like, this was like a 50-chapter arc as far as the manga goes that has been squished down into being a movie, so keep that in mind. So there is plenty that is omitted from the film, but that's to be expected when it comes to how much story they're putting into something like this. We don't get Orihime dealing with her hollow brother, we don't get Shrieker or the soul trapped in the bird, we don't get Don Kanonji, and I would have loved to see him, we don't even get Kon either. But for what the movie was trying to accomplish, it seemed like they were making smart decisions with what they were cutting out, and those aspects of the story that were cut didn't really have a good place here. But a Don Kanonji cameo on a TV could have been fun. That's all I'm saying. It could have been fun, it would have been easy, it could have been in the background, I would have loved that. So there was a lot of condensing, some mixing, and some really interesting choices made in order to kind of cram the story of early Bleach into here, and still have it be coherent, and be able to capture the spirit of the source material. And it worked pretty well for the most part. The grounded nature of the first arc of Bleach helps in its adaptation, I think. The filmmakers didn't have to really worry about translating fantastical other worlds like Soul Society or Waco Mundo, and it's hard to know how convincing those places would have looked in live action on this scale. Like, we got a couple shots of like the Serite in Soul Society, and it was all nighttime from what I remember. It was all kind of hidden in shadow and obscured by that, so like, I don't know. But I think this part of the story being in like the regular world definitely helps. Things were just pretty simple back in this part of the story. We had Ichigo running around the city with Rukia, learning about his Soul Reaper abilities and fighting hollows while going to high school and dealing with the grief and guilt about his mom. And that was all here. It felt like Bleach. Was it an exact replica of the first arc? No, and I don't think it should have been a one-for-one for what it's adapting, but it was very close in some respects, and there were some really interesting additions made too. There were a whole lot of training montages, which I actually really liked a lot. In general, I thought Ichigo and Rukia's friendship, which is the core of the story during this period, was handled brilliantly. Their dynamics were still the same, and Rukia felt even more like a coach that would become a friend, and for the limited amount of time the film has, this was the relationship that they needed to nail, and I think they succeeded overall. It carries a lot of real weight behind it throughout the runtime, and it's what allowed them to stick the landing at the end. And as for like the filmmaking itself, I thought the movie looked pretty good for the most part. There was solid direction, and it was fun seeing some now very familiar scenes brought to life from a slightly different perspective. The fights, while there weren't many, were also handled pretty well, and I thought captured the high-octane action that the series is known for. Let's get into the characters themselves. I thought Ichigo was fantastic in this movie. Soto Fukushi captured the spirit of our beloved Strawberry. He had the right nonchalant, stubborn attitude mixed with the confusion and the fun of learning to be a Soul Reaper. And most importantly, Ichigo in this was still most interested in protecting the people he cares about. Whereas something like the live-action One Piece kind of altered part of the core of its main character to suit the new medium, I thought Ichigo was pretty much brought straight from the page, and it worked. Like, I fully bought into the fact that this was Ichigo. And Rukia was also great. I feel like they played up her mentor role even more, and in some ways really honed in on her kind of more emotional aspects and the bond she formed with Ichigo, and she seemed sadder in this somehow. Like, it just, I don't know, I connected a lot with her. I thought they did a great job with Rukia. I thought she was fantastic. Orihime, on the other hand, didn't really stand out much to me in this movie, but that's fair since she didn't really stick out to me much in the manga till a bit later. And by not including anything with her brother's storyline, she never really gets any focus and is kind of just the girl that obviously has a crush on Ichigo, and nothing more. Uryu's okay. I thought they made his bow effects look pretty good, but as far as the character, he's kind of just used in this as an exposition dump when Ichigo needed information. He was a little too passive, if that makes sense, whereas the manga version has more of a fire to him to me, like a drive that's fueled by the responsibility left on his shoulders. This one didn't really have that, but he was definitely serviceable, like he was fine. He was kind of missing something for me as far as Uryu goes. But Chad in this movie just reminded me of like, this is probably gonna sound weird, but it's about the vibe, so hear me out. Chad reminded me of MJ in Spider-Man Homecoming, where he kind of just keeps showing up in the background looking disinterested and like doing random things. Like, Chad's a chill guy, but this didn't really feel that much like Chad to me somehow. I was waiting for him to do something. Anything, and when he finally does towards the end, it feels like an afterthought to a setup of a sequel we're apparently never gonna get. I didn't really buy into this being Chad, but I thought the biggest offenders as far as the characters were Renji and Byakuya. They showed up way earlier and stuck around, making deals and like negotiating and such, and like making ultimatums. They were more manipulative and scheming because they showed up earlier and were just kind of trying to manipulate things. It was a little weird. I don't know if it was the direction or the actors or just the way they were used, but their arrival in the manga was such a big moment, like such a shift in the narrative, and I think they really lacked that presence in this. There wasn't that feeling of sudden helplessness when they show up, and they only care about getting what they came for. Like, they were so decisive in the manga, and just straight up, we are here, we are gonna get Rukia back. That was it. Like, in this, it was more like, it felt like they were kind of just around. Now, I'm not expecting them to be their fully fleshed out selves that they eventually start to become, but even for what they were supposed to be back then, they just didn't capture the intimidation for me. Like, Renji just kept kind of sneering and making these weird expressions, and I thought it was an odd choice, and definitely not threatening. Byakuya was a little better, but he still lacked that kind of... I was intimidated by Byakuya in the manga when he first showed up. Like, he was kind of silent and scary, and like, this guy, I don't know, he just didn't really have that for me. But overall, he was okay. He was definitely better than Renji, but I thought their role in this was a little weird. And Urahara was in this, but not very much, so it was hard to gauge how well he was portrayed. He was definitely casted older than I imagined, but that's not inherently a bad thing. Yeah, it's hard to say with him. Overall, I thought everyone was serviceable, except maybe Renji, but despite some of them missing some of the things, they were fine for this movie. Even if like Chad was a bit underwhelming, and Byakuya and Renji were definitely not as scary as they were in the early parts of the manga. But overall, it was solid. It was solid. Now remember, guys, this is me, and anytime I have a chance to talk about hollows, I'm going to. There weren't nearly as many of my favorite monsters as there were in the manga. That's irrefutable. There was no acid wire, there was no numb chandelier, there was no bulbous G, but that's okay. There was no Menos Grande, there was no Shrieker, there was no guy turning into a demi-hollow. But I don't think it's a big problem considering most of the plots those hollows were used for. And it's also understandable considering CGI and visual effects budgets. Like, Kubo drawing these beautiful, horrific monstrosities isn't held back by how much money is being put into special effects, you know? His budget and his limit was his imagination. Still, selfishly, it makes me a little sad, but the hollows themselves, the ones we did see, looked pretty great considering the movie doesn't have like a Hollywood summer blockbuster amount of money pumped into it. Like, the effects themselves aren't always amazing for them, but the designs, I thought, were pretty cool interpretations of what the hollows could look like in, you know, a more realistic environment. I did really miss the Grand Fisher's lure and his design, though. Like, that to me is like the epicenter of his character, like in his predatory behavior. Not having that, he felt he was missing something. But speaking of my beautiful anglerfish hamster, he was actually treated as more of a big deal in this than he was at that point in the manga. We hear him mentioned from the beginning, and I liked that Rukia was pursuing him at first, and having Byakuya and Renji talk about him as a threat helped to really build up how dangerous he could be. And I was really happy with how they still maintained a lot of the horror of the character, even when they cut back on a lot of his screen time and a lot of his dialogue. We never got anything quite as creepy as in the manga when you see the little girl turn into his lure, but they still tried to make him creepy overall. And speaking of that little girl though, it was interesting that they specifically tied the Grand Fisher's origin to having been that little girl, instead of her just being bait that he uses. Like, he is like the former ghost of this little girl. It was interesting. It was a kind of I wonder if that is, I mean, we never really learned much about his past in the manga, so maybe that's the case there too, and we just never, you know, heard about that. But yeah, I thought that was kind of cool, actually. And like, the idea that this like innocent looking little girl could actually turn into something like this is kind of scary in a different way than the Grand Fisher's scary in the manga, so I thought that worked overall. The big battle between him and Ichigo happens in the middle of the city instead of like the area around a graveyard, which is definitely different, but that makes for like a bigger spectacle for the third act of a film, so I understood the change. And it was cool having this chaos happening in a populated area where most of the population can't see what's actually happening. Like, the whole place is getting destroyed, and these people have no idea what's going on. Like, is it a tornado, like a natural disaster? No, it's a dude with a huge sword fighting a giant monster, but not many people can see it. Like, I liked that. That was cool. And like, you guys know how much the memories in the Rain chapters mean to me, but I understand why they went this way with the movie. It's just a less melancholy fight overall between them that ends completely differently, with Ichigo defeating and destroying the Grand Fisher. Like, that's a massive change, but I think it works for the movie. Ichigo gets the personal retribution that he didn't get in the manga, and that, you know, that was something I expected to happen in the manga, but obviously some circumstances were very different. But for something that'll most likely be just a standalone movie, it made for a satisfying victory to have Ichigo actually defeat the Grand Fisher. I thought it worked here. It was definitely different, but it worked. But I was really sad for a few minutes that Isshin's speech to Ichigo at Masaki's grave seemed to have been left out of the movie. I think that's one of the most powerful scenes in Bleach, so I was so relieved when they ended up using it word for word near the end of the movie instead, around the dinner table. That's a prime example of how this movie shuffles things around, but still tries to do its best to keep important things. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest strength of this movie is that it kept the heart of those early chapters, which was the relationship between Ichigo and Rukia. And because they handled that aspect successfully, we were able to get a very powerful ending. In some ways, it felt like an even more tragic ending to when Rukia left in the manga. Ichigo returning her powers to her before she leaves, instead of her being taken and Ichigo's powers being severed by force, was, I think, a good change for what this movie is. The things they altered in this scene and the circumstances around it were actually really beautiful. It felt more like a permanent goodbye and less of a feeling of an abduction that we would have to save her from down the line. It felt final, like this amazing part of Ichigo's life was really ending. And I even like the way they dealt with Rukia leaving too. In the manga, Ichigo remembers Rukia, but no one else seems to until he finds out some people like Orihime also remember her due to their spiritual awareness. In this, once she leaves, everyone forgets her, including Ichigo, up until a really touching moment when he finds a note she'd written earlier, and it seems like it awakens his memories of her. There's almost shades of the tragic ending of Memories of Nobody, the first Bleach movie, in there, but it just really hit and was extremely effective at the end. I loved that, and it left me feeling good when the credits rolled. And that's a great thing with an anime adaptation. I wasn't screaming at my TV, I wasn't fuming, I wasn't going online to be upset about it. I felt good. And I would have been curious to see what a sequel to this would have been like. I imagine it would have been an adaptation of the Soul Society arc, and that's a whole lot of characters to bring into live action. Mayuri might have been too creepy to put on camera, and I don't know if there's a human being alive that can do Kenpachi justice. It definitely would have had to be a more expensive movie, considering the scale of Bleach increases exponentially starting around then, and they would have had to work hard, really hard, to build up to Aizen's betrayal properly in just like a 2-hour movie. At this point, it doesn't seem like we're ever going to get that sequel, but it's interesting to imagine. Was this movie perfect? No. But it was a solid effort, and I'd say easily one of the best live-action adaptations I've seen for an anime. It's definitely not flawless, but I thought they did more right than wrong, which is something I can't say about most of these types of movies. Adaptations can be different. They can make changes. It shouldn't be a one-for-one of the source material, that's boring. It should be close enough to be recognizable, but still leave room to do its own thing and leave its own mark. And for me, as long as the core of the story and the heart of its characters are properly preserved and presented, then that's what's most important. And I think this movie did that. This is still Bleach. It was a respectful, enjoyable live-action version of a manga series that I love. When companies inevitably keep trying to turn anime and manga series into live-action shows and movies, this should be a prime example of how you can do it. It's okay to be different, it's okay to make changes, as long as the story at its center remains pure. This movie still had the soul of Bleach. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I watched the movie twice recently to make sure I processed my feelings on it properly, and it was a good time both times. I thought it was solid. It was a fun movie, and yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys thought of this. If you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it if you're a Bleach fan. Like, give it a shot. It's definitely better than it could have been. That's for sure. Would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you thought of this movie. Would you have wanted to see a sequel? Do you think they could have even, handled Soul Society as a live-action movie? Let me know. I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys all have a great day. Take care.